That is the unfortunate state of affairs, and which brings us nicely on, really, to the report that we're looking at this morning, HO Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services, basically more or less admitting that the only thing the police have been doing in recent months has been sort of arresting people for breaching coronavirus restrictions and not much else.
No, this is really shocking. As you say, avoiding arresting criminals during the pandemic, writing off offences as no further action, more often than not. You saw just an explicit admittance, really, that there was this reduced service, a shift towards kind of more desk-based working, people waiting on a kind of web chat for 2 hours to report serious crimes, when previously those have been sorted out over the phone. And this is very serious. You know, there's some cases which are pointed to have wanted criminals remaining on the loose because those things weren't chased up. And meanwhile, as you say, I think I'm right in saying up until December last year, 32,000 fixed penalty notices, fines were issued to people for breaking the lockdown rules. Some of them, as we know, quite farcical and small instances of breaching those rules. So a real question for the police about their priorities during this pandemic, not just their resources, but how they're using those resources.
Indeed. And I noticed this weekend that there was a sort of clarion call put out by the government to local authorities to say, you know, would you mind sort of easing up a little bit on your, clamping down on people who might not be adhering to the rules. I don't actually know anybody at the moment, Tom, that knows what any of the rules are anymore.
Well, I think the problem during the pandemic is that a lot of the police didn't seem to know what the rules were either. And I've had some sympathy with the fact that, you know, you had the lockdown regulations changing, new ones coming in at a minute to midnight the day before they were brought in. A lot of human rights barristers struggled to keep track of what the rules were. But then you even saw police chiefs. You know, there was that police chief in Northamptonshire who gave a press conference in which he said they might have to start inspecting trolleys for illicit goods, despite the fact there was never any restrictions on what you could buy at the supermarket. This was the big Easter egg scandal last lockdown, if you'll remember, this time last year. So again, I think even though a lot of people don't know the rules themselves at this point, throughout this pandemic, it seems like a lot of the police don't know what the rules are either.
No, that's right. And I mean, Priti Patel has commissioned this study, and I mean, I don't wish to be unkind to Priti Patel, but she commissions an awful lot of studies, she makes an awful lot of speeches, she makes an awful lot of promises, but I don't actually see anything changing. And I mean, from the tightening of the borders to the clamping down on the illegal dinghies arriving from France to almost everything else that she says she's going to completely rearrange. Nothing's really changed, has it?
I think this government is like this on all kinds of issues, where they kind of do want to signal that they're interested in taking certain institutions to task, to sorting out the priorities of the police, to sorting out the BBC, whatever it happens to be. The substance of it never really materialises. And I think when you're talking about the police, this is so important because the police were being called into question way before the coronavirus pandemic and the terrifying overreach to sometimes quite silly overreach that we've seen with those lockdown rules. You know, the fact that there was that Times investigation in 2017, which found 9 people a day were being arrested for posting offensive things online. Meanwhile, you have people out in the public, you know, often even when they've been the victims of a burglary or they have their car being stolen, the police are basically there just to open and close an investigation so that you can sort out the insurance. Right. You know, this is many people's experience of police. They're often not there when they need them. So, you know, even before the coronavirus pandemic and the ridiculous scenes that we've seen taking place, the police were really called into question. So action does seem to need to be taken. But as you say, Priti Patel seems to just want to kind of signal to her base, as it were, rather than do anything.
Yeah, it's like a PR campaign without any real substance behind it. I remember back in sort of beginning again of the pandemic, when things were sort of slightly tighter, I suppose, than they are now. Loads of people who travelled down on the M5 to get to Devon were sort of stopped and turned back and handed £200 penalties, all of which turned out to be unenforceable and all of which ended up in the bin. So an awful lot of what they've issued ticket-wise isn't even legal, it seems.
No, completely. There was a story back last April where there were about 30 instances of the police issuing fines to children,
right? Which
is you know, fixed penalty notices should not be issued to children in any circumstance in this way. And also, as you say, just situations where the police had become kind of a law unto themselves. They were kind of making up the rules as they went along. I remember Dorset Police, which was also enforcing those kinds of travel restrictions to people driving a short way to exercise and so on, was not prescribed in law at all. But when they were confronted by Big Brother Watch, the human rights group, about this, they said explicitly, we don't care what the law says. This is about the spirit of the restrictions and how we're going to achieve them. So they really have been a law unto themselves at this point. They really do need to be reined in.
Right. And so if the government have now said to local authorities, don't give people such a hard time, presumably that's what's led to what some of the scenes are that we've seen, which I'm not objecting to, by the way, of lots of people being out and about, lots of pubs with gardens being absolutely rammed. There's no question in a lot of cases of people following the supposed COVID rules, is there?
No, I think that's right. And I think at the end of the day, mercifully, we don't have enough police to be a police state. The point at which people are
I'm starting to thank God that we don't have enough police.
Exactly. I mean, it's been a bit of a wake-up call for many people, I think. But at the end of the day, when the public are starting to relax, when they are seeing the risk evaporate because of the rollout of the vaccines and all the rest of it, they are going to start to bend and break these rules even more so than they might have been previously. And that's one thing which I think is kind of undervalued in this. The public kind of led us into lockdown in the first place. People starting to take more care, people starting to be more careful. The government were kind of chasing after public opinion in that respect. And I think the public will lead us out of it again. And I think that's what this kind of relaxing of the enforcement, is a recognition of, is that just public support for these kinds of draconian restrictions is starting to move away finally.
And I think it will be interesting to see how all this sort of unfurls over the course of the next few months, because I've always believed, and I've been saying it now for a few weeks, that as the lockdown lifts and as things start to become more doable, if you like, more and more people will start to do them. And more people will start to think, maybe I will go back to work, because there are my friends that are all in the city and they're all going out for a drink on Friday at 5 o'clock. And so maybe I will actually go to work that day. That kind of thing will start to happen. And I wonder where organisations like the Metropolitan Police and other police forces, and where that leaves them, because they've had this year of quite intense kind of difficulty and not really knowing what their job is. And I wonder how that's going to end up.
No, it's going to be interesting because, as you say, they're just going to have to take a new kind of relaxed approach to rules that certain police services in particular, it varies a lot across the country as far as how harshly they were being imposed. We're seriously enforcing them. But I think the problem is that they've still got big questions to answer in the longer term about what are the police for. And I think one thing that has really concerned people over this pandemic, even people who might previously have been quite supportive of the police, is that as soon as you hand them more draconian powers, they grab onto them with glee. And I think whether we're talking about the enforcement of the lockdown restrictions, whether or not we're talking about the rise of police spending more time on Twitter than they do actually policing people's communities at this point, you're starting to see that question being asked them about what is it are you actually for and what are your priorities? Because over the past year and beyond, we've seen that oftentimes their priorities are severely screwed up.
Yeah. And also, if you have been in some way arrested or charged with anything during this period, would you have the right as an individual to have that expunged from your record in some way? Because it might be that you should be able to do that.
No, that's a huge question. It's also a question with some of the restrictions on kind of policing speech and discussion that I'm sure you've touched on many times in the show. This phenomenon, these non-crime hate incidents, which Freedom of Information request last year found 120,000 of these things recorded. These things can show up on extended DBS checks, and they basically just boil down to someone being offended by something someone potentially posted on the internet, for instance, reporting it to the police, it not being investigated, and it just being logged. So all of these kinds of things I think are really concerning about encroaching on people's liberties in that respect. But it feels like now people are starting to wake up to that level of police overreach and how we might tackle it.
Yeah, because another piece I was looking at this morning is about these COVID loan fraudsters and how many people have managed to get money out of the government as a result of them being very generous, you'd have to say, and you can't fault them, I suppose, for that. But obviously, like all government schemes, it's got full of holes, and loads of people have ripped them off for money that they've either borrowed and not paid back, and disappeared off and folded the company, or formed companies to just get free money and all of that. And they're now basically saying the Revenue and Customs people will probably never be able to prosecute any of them.
Yeah, I know, it's really, really striking. I mean, you can kind of understand when they set up all of these loan schemes, etc. I mean, Rishi Sunak said this quite explicitly to his credit that, we're prioritising speed and ease over these kinds of concerns. But at the same time, you would hope there would be some kind of recourse, given the fact that, unfortunately, even at a time of national crisis, there are always going to be some people who are going to try and take advantage of it. Surely there's some payback.
Yeah, there really does have to be. And as far as the sort of the rest of what we now have left as April is concerned, I suppose. I mean, I think if the weather continues to be as nice as this, I think we're going to be basically out of lockdown in about a week because, there's going to be so many people out and about, so many people getting involved in pubs and restaurants and all the rest of it, that, as you say, the police won't be able to handle it.
I think that's right. And I think that what we're really seeing is that people are starting to relax because they're making a very rational judgment. You know, they might have been vaccinated. Certainly their elderly and vulnerable relatives will have been vaccinated. They know that we're de-risking COVID by the day, basically, through this vaccine rollout, regardless of how much Boris Johnson seems to want to play it down. And I think that's the point where just the consent for these restrictions we've been living under will start to melt away. The problem is, and one thing we've got to be really careful about, is the way in which some of these restrictions live on in statute in one form or other after the pandemic, which we're already seeing that in relation to protests. We're already seeing that in other ways. And I think that's the thing we've got to work, because it feels like the lockdown itself is starting to evaporate, but how those restrictions might live on in one way or another is going to be
well, Mark Harper mentioned that this morning on Julie Hartley-Brewer's show on Talk Radio, where he was talking about, June the 21st is this kind of magical date where everything's supposed to be lifted and we are supposed to return to normal, and it will be the old normal. There won't be social distancing. There shouldn't be mask wearing. But he said that he spotted in the statutes that everything will disappear aside from some COVID regulations, which is all a bit vague.
No, that contradiction is what we've really got to keep our eye on. Because 21st of June has been presented as the kind of big liberation point. But as you say, if you look at some of those government statements, if you look at the reviews, which are still ongoing, questions around what restrictions hospitality venues might have to exist under, it isn't really going to be that big bang, it seems like. Some of these could live on well on later into the year because the government has taken this ultra cautious approach. So I think we've got to remain very eagle-eyed and skeptical of the way this easing of the lockdown happens, because slow as it is, I think it's even a fair bit slower than we've been led to believe.
Yeah, you may well be right. Vigilance will be the watchword. Tom, thank you very much indeed. Tom Slater, Deputy Editor of Spiked Online there. I think it makes a very good point. I mean, if you've been fined or you have been arrested or something during this pandemic in any way, shape or form, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to know what your experience was. And I'd like to know what they're telling you about how long anything like a fine or anything like an arrest actually stays on your record. Are you able to get rid of it? Are you able to ask for them to strike it from the record, like you're supposed to be able to ask them to strike your DNA from any records that they might have if you are found not to be charged with something, but they've swabbed you in a police station? Similarly, I'd love to know what happened to you when you reported a crime to the police. Did you, in the end, have to just give up altogether? What did they do? What did they tell you? Did they come and help you? Did they catch anyone? 0344 499 1000 is the number. We'll take your calls next.